Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you all for having us out here and for
How you doing? Good to see you again. Real quick, I want to thank Isaiah Knox, the board chair, Mr. Wireman, Heather, everybody in the KO and Creative Visions for putting this organization together. I think it's of vital importance that we hear from our candidates and that we also hold them accountable by asking them the questions that matter to our community. So I really appreciate everybody showing up, and I truly appreciate you, Beto, for coming down and not only just coming to this event, but knocking the doors. That's something that is much needed in this community. If you look at other candidates from election cycle after election cycle, this is one community that they tend to miss. But I was surprised when I was driving down, going by a Trinity Church, and I see you walking. So it's very much, it warms my heart to see candidates do that, and I hope a lot of other people follow that. So my question is a voting rights question. Many of you guys will probably remember back in 2016 when Secretary of State Matt Schultz tried to purge the polls with our Latino brothers and sisters. We've heard the stories of what's happened in Georgia and Florida with this past election when it comes to voter suppression. What is your plan to ensure equal access to the voting right, to the ballot? And then also, what will you do to decrease and eliminate voter suppression?
Yeah. Great question. Thank you, Cam. In my home state of Texas, we were 50th in voter turnout in the country, and that is not because we love democracy less than you do here in Iowa, but to the point you were just making, we were literally drawn that way. So African American, Mexican American, communities of color, drawn out of congressional districts to disperse and diminish the impact of their vote, the likelihood that their voice would ever be heard. And the results were predictable and in fact planned, not by accident. You mentioned Georgia. Stacey Abrams would be the governor of that state right now if it were not for the purging of hundreds of thousands of names on the voter roll. It's the reason that we had the Voting Rights Act in the first place in 1965, was to prevent just these kinds of things from happening, especially in the former Confederacy, in states like mine that had a long history post-Reconstruction of disenfranchising communities of color. So what's the answer to this? A new Voting Rights Act that will guarantee that no one is kept out of the ballot box, that will stop the purges of these voter rolls. Add to that making Election Day a national holiday so everyone can take the time to go out and vote. Automatic and same-day voter registration. If we do that, we estimate we can get about 50 million more Americans registered by 2024. If we remove the barriers before them to be able to cast that vote, then there is no stop in this country. And I really could care less what the partisan result of that ends up being. If everyone in America is participating in our democracy, then this country will reflect the will of this country. And right now, it's not doing that for the reasons that you just described. So a new Voting Rights Act and a massive expansion of the electorate to include everyone who's eligible in this country. Thanks for asking. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Hello, Jackie Zungi, and I am the state health chair for the NAACP. So I'm not going to ask you if you support the Affordable Care Act, because we're all going to assume that you do.
Yes, ma'am.
But recently there have been challenges, court challenges and so forth. And the most recent, the current administration is trying to chip away at very important components of the Affordable Care Act, Section 1557, which guarantees everyone the right to an interpreter, things such as that. How would you, let's assume that when you were elected president, the Congress remains the same, or, some shape and form of that. How would you provide leadership to help people understand how important health care in its present form in the Affordable Care Act is for our country?
Jackie, thanks for the question, and thanks for your work on this. You and others have helped me to understand some of the consequences of decisions that Iowa has made. The privatization of Medicaid, which is really tough across the state, really hard in rural communities especially. I've learned that Iowa ranks, I talked about Texas being 50th in voter turnout. Somebody told me Iowa ranks 51st, I guess, behind all the states in Washington, D.C., or maybe Puerto Rico, when it comes to mental health care access and availability. It was one of the things that Isaiah took time to tell me about that we're providing here to make up for that gap that we have in the country. Now, if you're a Republican, you care just as much as a Democrat does about your child's ability to see a mental health care provider if he or she has schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or clinical depression. Those conditions know no political boundary. I would want to appeal to the constituents of those Republican members if we assume that the composition of Congress remains the same, and say, look, I'm not talking about giveaways, I'm not talking about anything un-American, I'm not talking about anything less than making sure that your constituents and their children are well enough to live to their full potential, don't have to get their mental health care in the county jail, which in Texas is the largest provider of mental health care services today. We, in meetings like these throughout the state, folks would stand up and they'd say, I just want you to know my brother who has schizophrenia got arrested on purpose to go to the county jail to get care that he could not receive anywhere else. As taxpayers, it costs us more than $110 a night to keep a man locked up for something that he could be treated for at a fraction of the cost on the outside through world-class outpatient health care. So you mentioned the ACA at the outset. At a minimum, let's protect protections for pre-existing conditions. No lifetime cap on care. But I think we've got to go much bigger and far beyond that. Our plan, Medicare for America, says everyone gets health care in this country. No copays for mental health care, primary health care, medications, or the full spectrum of reproductive health care for women in this country. And if you have employer-sponsored insurance or you fought for it with your union and you like it and you want to keep it, you're able to do that as well. So I think we can defend the gains that we've made so far among those that you cited, but then we've got to vastly expand protections for all Americans, and then make the case to everybody that it's in the interests of America to make sure that everyone in America is well enough to fulfill their potential. Thanks for asking, Jackie. Appreciate it.
Mr. President.
Hi, I'm Rich Wireman, and you spoke of how this community embraces diversity and how it has an inclusive nature. That's really important. But it's also important for this community to be able to earn a fair wage.
Yes.
A fair minimum wage to allow them a quality of life. You spoke to the quality of life. So as president, what would you do to bring the members of Congress together to find some common ground and address the issue with allowing us to have a minimum wage that will allow that quality of life that is so needed?
Yeah.
Great question, Rich, and I think I would approach it this way. Do you think, I'd ask the members of Congress, there should be a minimum wage at all? And if you don't, and you think that if someone's willing to work for 50 cents an hour, then you should be able to pay them 50 cents an hour, then that ends the conversation. But most people will agree there should be some floor below which you cannot pay another human being because they just cannot subsist on it. And if you reach that conclusion together, then you'd also have to agree that $7.25, which is the minimum wage in so many states still today in America, is not a living wage. You would need to work a second, and in many states, a third job just to pay the rent, put food on the table, provide for yourself, and maybe, just maybe, have something set aside in case there were an emergency. And when we do that, we basically guarantee that the minimum wage earner also has to be subsidized, or their employer, this is the right way to put it, has to be subsidized by the taxpayer through Medicaid, through CHIP, through other programs that you qualify for based on income, including supplemental nutrition and assistance program. So if we paid a living wage, much like the answer on healthcare, people are much better to live to their full potential, better able to shoulder their fair share of the burden, contribute far more back to the success of this community. And as you probably know from looking at this, those communities and states that have raised the minimum wage have had a negligible impact on total employment. In fact, they've done better economically than those states that have not. So I think there's a great case to be made. I think we have to listen to those who don't come to the same conclusion that we do. But ultimately, we've got to be able to move forward on this, or we're going to lose generations of Americans who are going to give up on any ability to be able to provide for themselves because they just can't at a minimum wage that we have today. So $15 an hour would be the goal that I would seek, the floor below which you cannot pay someone. Thanks for asking.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Beto, Carl McPherson with the PAC for NAACP, as well as Central Iowa Chapter of Blacks in Government. Would you clarify for us, please, how you plan to engage people of color, communities of faith in the political process during this campaign, and just basically in a manner that will not be pandering.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's probably nothing better for any of us who are in public life or running for office or hold a position of public trust than to, as Akeo said earlier, go to where people are. So literally to knock on doors in every community. And specifically to go to those communities that have been kept out of the political process or kept from enjoying the benefits of this economy or kept down by law, as I alluded to at the outset in my comments. So important to start there and to be there and to listen to those who not only can detail their problems and challenges, but very often bring to the table the solutions to those challenges and to those problems. And so, you know, I will not pretend to know what every single one of those issues are until I've been to those communities, listened to the people involved. And that's what I've been doing as a candidate for the presidency, both in forums. I met some of you, and I got to see Cam again at the NAACP forum in Detroit at the National Convention, but also just knocking on doors and having unguarded, honest, individual, eyeball-to-eyeball conversations. And then including that, reflecting that in the campaign that you see me run, the policy proposals that I have presented. I'll just give you one example. Access to capital. The ability to start a small business or grow the business that you already have. I believe that women of color are starting and growing businesses in America at 14 times the rate as the average American. So that is an economic growth engine if I've ever seen it. But women of color have also been kept from capital through redlining. They've been preyed upon through predatory lending practices. Our response to that, double the size of the community development finance institutions that make small business loans within a community, primarily to communities of color and women of color, so that they can create more job openings, hire more people, pay better wages, expand the products and services that they provide. That idea came not from me, but from people that I listened to as I traveled the country. And that's just one focused on growth and economic opportunity, but would love to continue the conversation with you on this, but that's my approach on how to get the best ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Hi, June, and I'm with Vold, Iowa. I have two questions. One, day one in the Oval Office, are you willing to declare a climate emergency?
Yes.
Okay, great. And number two, a local question.
Yeah.
Are you aware that the Dakota Access Pipeline, ETP wants to double the oil going through the pipeline right now, and which increases the risk of a spill
Yes.
exponentially? Would you be willing to come out against that?
Absolutely unafraid of standing up to any oil or energy or pipeline or energy transportation company, especially when listening to local stakeholders, and whether those are native indigenous communities, whether they are big cities by which or under which those pipelines pass. I think one of our failings as a country is we have not allowed the people who live in the communities affected by pollution, by environmental damage, to have a voice. And in fact, you probably know this, one of the best predictors of your proximity to a toxic polluter is the color of your skin, or your ethnicity, or your country of national origin. That's where we have located the contaminants and the risk connected to them. Rates of asthma, rates of cancer, rates of the conditions that are connected to how close you live to a polluter are way up in communities of color right now. I was talking to somebody from Houston, and we were talking about Hurricane Harvey in 2017. Look at those communities that flooded. Look at who bears the brunt of the kinds of quote-unquote natural disasters, which, to your first question, are caused by you and by me and by our fellow human beings. Emissions, excesses, inaction in the face of the facts and the science. There are some communities more than others who are bearing the brunt of that. And so yes, we declared an emergency on day one, and yes, we stopped all new oil and gas leases on public lands, on our protected waterways, no ANWR in Alaska or the Arctic. All purchasing decisions from the government reflect the cost of carbon and pollution and climate change, and we very conscientiously free ourselves from a dependence on fossil fuels. It's renewable wind, solar, geothermal, biofuels, which you all have pushed here in Iowa, but it's also allowing farmers to do their part, capturing carbon through sustainable regenerative agricultural and ranching practices. There's a lot that we can do, and America could take the lead, and as president, I will. Thank you for asking. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Millions of young people today are suffering from student loan debt. They're really burdened by how much they have to spend and how much they have to borrow in order to gain an education today. As a president, what would you do to help us with that?
Last night in Des Moines, I met two extraordinary young women who are about to start their first year at Grinnell. And the excitement and the anticipation on their faces, and just remembering what it was like for me to be able to go to college. I want that to be an opportunity for every single American. And right now it's out of reach for millions of Americans and for their families. In our case, I took student loans, I was a recipient of grants, I had a work-study job, and my parents took out loans as well. And were sorely disappointed in my choice of major. They said, we're going to take out all this debt so you can read books as an English major? What are you thinking, Beto? What good is this going to do you? So how do we make that available to everybody? One, we ensure that the first 2 years of college, maybe we could turn that down, Connor. The first 2 years of college are free for every American. So at a minimum, you would be earning your associate's degree in those first 2 years, or it'd be the first 2 years of your undergraduate degree. Full 4 years, debt-free for lower income and middle income Americans, but debt-free not just for tuition, but for room and board and books, the full cost, the full ride of being able to go to school. And then if you have part of the $1.5 trillion in outstanding student loan debt, we forgive that if you dedicate some part of your life to public service. Teach in a school, work at the VA, work for the federal, the state, the local government. If you're going to improve the quality of life for all of us, if you're going to serve a veteran, teach a child, I want to make sure that you can focus on that and not on repaying that debt. And then lastly, I was just with members of the AFL-CIO today. I want to make sure that if you do not pursue college, that you are well equipped to pursue a career. So creating millions more apprenticeships in America, and making them fundamental to any infrastructure, green infrastructure, climate change infrastructure plan that we have, so that you are paid to learn a trade or a skill that you will command for the rest of your life. We were talking about dignity earlier. It is so connected to your dignity and sense of self-worth, and unions have a key role to play in being able to achieve that. Thanks for asking the question. Appreciate it.
Yeah, question line.
Hey there.
Marvin Alexander, NAACP committee member. And you've already kind of touched on this in one of your earlier responses, but if you could tell us, how do you plan on regulating and improving the environmental and pollution disparities that always seems to impact minority communities?
Thank you for the question. Our climate change plan calls for mobilizing $5 trillion over the next 10 years. It's investing in the ingenuity and innovation of American enterprise, making sure that we come up with the next generation of wind and solar, the battery storage technologies to distribute that energy onto the grid. But it also is going to be invested in fortifying communities who today are on the front lines of climate change. And as you just said, so often and predictably, communities of color and lower income communities. So investing in stormwater drainage and infrastructure, investing in fortifying homes and businesses for the inevitable floods that we're going to see in Houston, which has had 3 500-year floods in just the last 5 years, and making sure that those who've borne the brunt of climate change are also able to be among the first to take the high value, high wage, high-skilled jobs that we create as we confront climate change and lead the globe in doing that. In the way that I look at it, some country is going to figure this out and take the lead. It could be China, it could be us. In our administration, it's going to be us. It's going to be the United States of America. And I want to lift up those who have literally been kept down by climate change, by where we direct pollutants and toxins and the environmental damage from climate change right now. So thanks for asking the question and pointing that out. Appreciate it.
Okay, this is going to be our last question.
Hello, how are you?
Speaking of Houston.
A brother from Houston and my native Texan. I am here, my name is Negus Simahotep, and I'm here to ask this particular question. Dealing with H.R. 40, House Bill 40, reparations. What is your stance, and what would you do to help push this particular bill?
It's interesting because we were just sharing our common love of Houston, a city that you spend a lot of time in, a city that I've had a chance to spend a lot of time in, a city that we were just talking about in terms of climate change and Hurricane Harvey and 58 inches of rain. Houston, as you know, is also the hometown of Sheila Jackson Lee, who is the author of H.R. 40. That's my hometown. And that's your hometown. And, you know, she has taken the lead on a really important, very difficult issue for this country to address and to even talk about. And that is deciding how we are going to address the legacy of 400 years since the beginning of slavery in the United States, this month in 1619 in Virginia. And a legacy not just of those enslaved, but their descendants who, through Jim Crow, through redlining, through segregation, through suppression, in our democracy, in our economy, in our schools, a 5-year-old child, 5 times as likely, at least in the state of Texas, to be disciplined, suspended, or expelled in a kindergarten classroom if he or she is a child of color versus a white child in front of the same teacher for the same infraction. So it is not one part of American life, it is all of American life. What Sheila Jackson Lee, I think, wants to do with this bill is begin the national conversation and tell the true national story. Upon whose backs was the greatness of America built? Who contributed in the most meaningful ways to our opportunity to distinguish ourselves? Whose land was this originally? And who was given land after the abolition of slavery and then had that land taken from? So the full story, so that every American, including Americans who look like me, can no longer turn a blind eye or turn their backs or turn away from the truth. And if we can do that, I am confident that we can begin the work of repair at the root of reparations. And we can also ensure that we stop visiting these injustices on future generations. So as president, I will sign Sheila Jackson Lee's bill into law. We'll do everything I can to help take the lead in bringing everyone to the table to tell everyone's story so that we get this right as a country. Thanks for asking the question. Really appreciate it. Beto, thank you all for having us out here today. Isaiah, thank you so much.